Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1843 when the first rumors began to circulate about the Whitfield estate. Situated approximately 3 miles outside Savannah's bustling center, the property stood as a testament to old Southern wealth, a 2-story white colonial mansion with 6 imposing columns and a wraparound porch that offered views of the surrounding cotton fields. For decades, the Whitfield name had been synonymous with prosperity, social standing, and unquestioned respectability. Thomas Whitfield had been one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Chatham County, his family's roots stretching back to Georgia's colonial days. But it wasn't the man's considerable fortune that would eventually cause whispers to travel through Savannah's cobblestone streets. It was what happened after his death, when his widow Eleanor made a decision that would shake the foundations of antebellum society. The case first came to light when a clerk at the Chatham County Courthouse noticed irregularities in the probate documents filed following Thomas Whitfield's passing. According to records later recovered from the Georgia Historical Society archives in 1962, the clerk, whose name was recorded as William Johnson, made a notation in his private journal about a most peculiar arrangement regarding the Whitfield estate. "I fear Mrs. Whitfield has taken leave of her senses," he wrote, "or perhaps has been unduly influenced in her bereavement." What followed was a series of events that even today remains difficult to fully comprehend. A story of forbidden attachments, social taboos, and the lengths to which the powerful would go to preserve their standing, even if it meant erasing people from history itself. The Whitfield estate stood for nearly 120 years before it was destroyed in a fire in 1957. By then, the story of Eleanor Whitfield and her unusual heir had faded from public memory, confined to sealed court documents and private correspondence locked away in family archives. But some stories refused to remain buried. In the summer of 1968, during renovations of the old Chatham County Courthouse, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a wall panel in what had once been the judge's chambers. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, containing handwritten accounts of the Whitfield case, accounts that had never been entered into the official record. What follows is the story pieced together from these recovered documents, newspaper clippings, personal correspondence, and the few surviving testimonies of those who witnessed the events firsthand. It is a story of how the widow Eleanor Whitfield defied the conventions of her time in ways that would lead to whispers of madness, manipulation, and murder. And how, in the shadows of one of America's most hauntingly beautiful cities, a legacy was born that some would sacrifice everything to conceal. In Savannah, they still say that on certain nights, when the Spanish moss sways in the breeze off the Savannah River and fog rises from the ground like ghostly fingers, the sound of footsteps can be heard on the land where the Whitfield plantation once stood, footsteps that seemed to pace endlessly, searching for something that was promised but never delivered. Thomas Whitfield was 49 years old when he died on April 23, 1843. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplexy, what we would now recognize as a stroke. At the time of his passing, Thomas had been one of Chatham County's most prominent citizens, a man whose opinion carried weight in both business and political circles. His funeral was attended by over 300 mourners, including the mayor of Savannah and 2 state representatives. The procession from St. John's Episcopal Church to Bonaventure Cemetery stretched for nearly half a mile. Thomas was laid to rest in the Whitfield family mausoleum, an imposing structure of Georgia marble that still stands today, though the name has been worn nearly smooth by time and weather. Eleanor Whitfield was 26 years old when she became a widow. According to census records, she had been married to Thomas for 7 years, but had produced no children. This fact alone would have made her position precarious in 19th century Georgia society. A young, childless widow with substantial property was bound to attract attention, not all of it welcome. But it was what Eleanor did in the weeks following her husband's death that truly set Savannah society ablaze with scandal. According to the newly discovered documents, 2 weeks after Thomas was laid to rest, Eleanor summoned her husband's attorney, James Crawford, to the Whitfield estate. Crawford later recorded in his private correspondence that he found the young widow composed and clear of mind, if somewhat altered in demeanor. He had expected to discuss the standard matters of probate and inheritance, but instead found himself faced with a most unusual request. Eleanor Whitfield intended to free one of her husband's slaves, a man recorded only as Samuel, and furthermore, to name him as a beneficiary in her husband's estate. In 1843 Georgia, such an action wasn't merely scandalous, it bordered on the revolutionary. The state had some of the strictest laws in the South regarding manumission, the legal act of freeing enslaved persons. Since 1818, Georgia law had required that any freed slave leave the state within 30 days or risk re-enslavement. Furthermore, the Georgia legislature had enacted statutes specifically prohibiting the bequest of property to enslaved persons. What Eleanor was proposing wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was, by the standards of the time, legally impossible. Crawford's letters reveal his immediate concern for Eleanor's reputation. "I caution Mrs. Whitfield in the strongest possible terms against such a course of action," he wrote to his brother in Charleston. "I reminded her of her position in society and the irreparable damage such a gesture would cause. Yet she remained unmoved by my concerns, insisting that it had been her husband's wish, though no such provision appeared in the will I myself had drafted for Mr. Whitfield the previous year." This discrepancy between Eleanor's claim and the actual contents of Thomas Whitfield's will would become the first of many troubling questions surrounding the case. If Thomas had truly wished to make provisions for Samuel, why had he not included such instructions in his legal will? And if the provision was Eleanor's idea alone, what could possibly motivate a young Southern widow to risk her standing, her inheritance, and potentially her freedom on behalf of one of her husband's slaves? The answer, as it often does in cases of this nature, appears to lie in the complex and often contradictory relationships that existed within the household itself. According to household inventories included in the estate papers, Samuel had been purchased by Thomas Whitfield in 1835, the same year Thomas married Eleanor. Unlike most of the field hands who worked the cotton plantation, Samuel was listed as a house servant and valued at the considerable sum of $1,200, nearly twice the typical price for an enslaved man at that time. This high valuation suggests special skills or education, though the nature of these is not specified in the surviving records. What is clear from the documents is that Samuel occupied an unusual position within the Whitfield household. While most enslaved persons lived in quarters separate from the main house, estate plans indicate that Samuel was provided a room in the carriage house connected to the main residence by a covered walkway. This proximity to the family living quarters was uncommon and suggests a role of particular trust. Furthermore, household account books show that while other enslaved persons on the property were provided standard allotments of food and clothing, Samuel received additional items, including tailored clothing, books, and on at least 3 occasions, medical attention from the same physician who treated the Whitfield family rather than the plantation's usual doctor. These details, while seemingly minor, paint a picture of an enslaved person who held a position of unusual privilege within the household hierarchy. Yet they do little to explain why Eleanor Whitfield would risk everything to name him as a beneficiary after her husband's death. For that explanation, we must turn to the most disturbing document found in the hidden courthouse compartment, a personal journal believed to belong to Rebecca Turner, Eleanor's lady's maid, and one of the few people with intimate access to the Whitfield household's private affairs. The journal, which covers the period from 1841 to 1844, contains observations about daily life in the Whitfield home, including cryptic references to tensions between Thomas and Eleanor. According to Turner's writings, the marriage had grown increasingly strained in the years prior to Thomas's death. She describes Thomas as cold and often absent, noting that he frequently traveled to Savannah for business and social engagements, leaving Eleanor alone at the plantation for weeks at a time. During these absences, Turner records that Eleanor would often seek the company of S. for reading and conversation, finding in him an educated mind so lacking in her marital companion. This reference to Samuel's education is particularly significant, as literacy among enslaved persons was unusual and often actively discouraged or prohibited in antebellum Georgia. The journal suggests that Samuel had somehow acquired not just basic literacy, but substantial education, making him a suitable intellectual companion for the obviously educated Eleanor. Turner notes that Eleanor would sometimes spend entire afternoons in the estate's library with Samuel, the doors closed as they discussed literature and philosophy, activities that would have raised eyebrows even if conducted with a white man who wasn't her husband, let alone with an enslaved person. Turner's journal becomes increasingly concerned as 1842 progresses. She records overhearing an argument between Thomas and Eleanor in December of that year, during which Thomas allegedly threatened to sell the fellow downriver, a common threat meaning sale to the more brutal plantation conditions of the Deep South. Eleanor's response, as recorded by Turner, was uncharacteristically vehement. "I would sooner see this house reduced to ashes." The implications of these entries are difficult to ignore, yet they remain frustratingly ambiguous. Was the relationship between Eleanor and Samuel merely that of intellectual companions, a lonely woman seeking conversation with one of the few educated minds available to her? Or was there something more, something that would explain why, after Thomas's death, Eleanor would risk everything to secure Samuel's freedom and financial security? The answer may lie in another document discovered alongside Turner's journal, a letter written by Dr. Richard Harris, the Whitfield family physician, dated October 12, 1842. The letter, addressed to a medical colleague in Charleston, describes a professional dilemma. "I have recently examined Mrs. W. on account of persistent complaints of fatigue and melancholy. In the course of my examination, I discovered evidence suggesting she is with child, approximately 4 months along. This presents a delicate situation, as Mr. Wood has been absent on business in Augusta for the past 5 months, returning only for a single weekend in July. If Dr. Harris's assessment was correct, and if his timeline is to be believed, the implications are both clear and shocking. Thomas Whitfield could not have been the father of Eleanor's child, and if the child was not Thomas's, the number of possibilities in the isolated plantation setting was limited indeed. The doctor's letter continues, "I have not yet informed Mrs. of my conclusions, nor have I spoken of this matter to anyone else. I find myself in an impossible position, caught between professional discretion and moral obligation. The consequences, should this matter become known, would be severe for all involved." Dr. Harris's moral quandary was apparently resolved by events. Turner's journal records that in November 1842, Eleanor suffered a miscarriage while Thomas was once again away on business. The only people present were Turner herself and Samuel, who was sent to fetch the doctor only after the worst had passed. According to Turner, Thomas was never informed of the pregnancy or its loss. This concealed tragedy adds yet another layer to the complex relationship between Eleanor and Samuel, and potentially explains why, after Thomas's death, Eleanor was so determined to secure Samuel's future. If he was indeed the father of her lost child, her actions take on a new and profoundly human dimension. not merely shocking defiance of social conventions, but an act of love and loyalty transcending the brutally rigid boundaries of her time. Yet the story grows darker still. Crawford's letters reveal that when he refused to help Eleanor execute her plan to free Samuel and make him a beneficiary, she dismissed him as her attorney. 2 weeks later, she engaged the services of Martin Hayes, a lawyer newly arrived from Boston with a reputation for harboring abolitionist sympathies. Hayes agreed to draw up the necessary papers, creating a complex legal arrangement that would technically maintain the letter of Georgia law while still achieving Eleanor's aims. The plan, as outlined in Hayes's notes, was audacious. Eleanor would sell Samuel to Hayes for the token sum of $5. Hayes would then take Samuel to Philadelphia, where he would free him according to Pennsylvania law. Once legally free, Samuel would return to Georgia not as a freed slave, which would have been illegal, but as a free black man from the North, a status that, while still severely restricted, was at least legally recognized. Meanwhile, Eleanor would establish a trust in Philadelphia, funded by portions of the Whitfield estate that would provide for Samuel's financial security. It was a plan that exploited loopholes in Georgia's legal system, and it might have worked had it not been for the intervention of Thomas Whitfield's brother, Charles. According to court records filed in May 1843, Charles Whitfield challenged both Thomas's will and Eleanor's right to dispose of the estate assets, claiming that she was of unsound mind and under the undue influence of persons hostile to the family's interests. He specifically requested that the court prevent the sale of the slave Samuel and any transfer of assets outside the state of Georgia until the matter could be resolved. The judge, William Parker, issued a temporary injunction as requested. Eleanor was prohibited from selling any assets, including enslaved persons, or transferring funds outside Georgia. Furthermore, the court appointed a guardian ad litem to assess Eleanor's mental state and determine whether she was indeed competent to manage the substantial Whitfield estate. The guardian, Dr. George Thompson, visited the Whitfield plantation on 3 separate occasions in June 1843. His report, which survives in the court records, presents a disturbing portrait of Eleanor's situation. "I found Mrs. Whitfield to be lucid and articulate," he wrote, "displaying no signs of derangement or feeble-mindedness. She speaks with clarity regarding business matters and demonstrates appropriate knowledge of her late husband's affairs." However, Thompson noted with concern that Eleanor appeared unusually attached to her household servants, particularly Samuel, whom she insisted on having present during all 3 interviews, despite Thompson's requests for private consultation. Thompson's conclusion was carefully worded. "While I cannot in good conscience declare Mrs. Whitfield mentally incompetent, I must express concern regarding her judgment in certain matters, particularly her stated intention to manumit and provide for certain enslaved persons. Such intentions reveal a concerning disregard for social propriety and may indeed indicate a moral confusion that, while not rising to the level of legal incompetence, nonetheless suggests the wisdom of additional oversight regarding the disposition of the Whitfield estate." Based on Thompson's assessment, Judge Parker extended the temporary injunction and appointed Charles Whitfield as co-administrator of his brother's estate. Eleanor was permitted to remain in the family home and would receive an allowance for her maintenance, but all major financial decisions would require Charles's approval. It was at this point that the situation took its most tragic turn. On the morning of July 17th, 1843, a house servant discovered that Samuel was missing from his quarters. A search of the property revealed no trace of him. Charles Whitfield immediately assumed that Eleanor had arranged for Samuel's escape, potentially with the assistance of her attorney Hayes, and he demanded that the sheriff organize a search party to track down and recapture the valuable property. Eleanor, however, insisted that she had no knowledge of Samuel's whereabouts. According to witness statements, She appeared genuinely distressed by his disappearance, even offering a substantial reward from her personal funds for information leading to his safe return. The search party, consisting of the sheriff, several deputies, and a professional slave catcher with tracking dogs, set out that afternoon to search the surrounding countryside. They returned 3 days later with a grim discovery. Samuel's body had been found hanging from a cypress tree in the swampland, approximately 2 miles from the Whitfield property. The official report stated that Samuel had attempted to escape, became disoriented in the swamp, and realizing capture was inevitable, had taken his own life rather than face punishment. This explanation was accepted without question by the authorities, and Samuel was buried in an unmarked grave on the edge of the Whitfield property, as was customary for enslaved persons. Eleanor, upon hearing the news, reportedly collapsed and had to be confined to her bed under sedation for several days. When she recovered physically, witnesses described her as altered, silent, and withdrawn, where once she had been engaging and spirited. She ceased challenging Charles's control of the estate and retreated into an increasingly isolated existence within the Whitfield mansion. The official narrative of Samuel's death might have remained unchallenged were it not for an entry in Turner's journal dated August 3rd, 1843. "Mrs. You spoke to me today for the first time since the terrible news." She said only, "They murdered him, Rebecca. They murdered him because he knew too much." When I asked what she meant, she fell silent again and would say no more. I fear for her mind, and perhaps for her safety as well. This cryptic entry raises disturbing questions about Samuel's death. If he was indeed murdered rather than having taken his own life, who was responsible? The most obvious suspect would be Charles Whitfield, who had the strongest motive to prevent any disruption to the family's inheritance and social standing. Yet there is no direct evidence linking him to Samuel's death, and the sheriff's report was signed and verified by multiple witnesses. What did Eleanor mean by saying that Samuel knew too much? The most likely explanation relates to the nature of their relationship and her pregnancy, but Turner's journal suggests another possibility. In an entry dated June 10th, 1843, during the period when Dr. Thompson was evaluating Eleanor's mental state, Turner wrote, "S. confided to me today that he believes Mr. Thomas did not die of natural causes. He has suspicions about the circumstances, but would not elaborate further. He seemed frightened and made me promise not to repeat his words to anyone, not even to Mrs. Eleanor." This single entry introduces the most shocking possibility of all, that Thomas Whitfield's death may not have been the result of natural causes, as officially recorded. If Samuel had reason to believe that Thomas had been murdered, and if he had shared these suspicions with others beyond Turner, it would provide a powerful motive for someone to ensure his permanent silence. The historical record falls frustratingly silent on this point. No autopsy was performed on Thomas Whitfield's body, as was typical for the time when the cause of death seemed obvious. Dr. Harris, who signed the death certificate, made no mention of suspicious circumstances in any of his surviving correspondence. If Thomas was indeed murdered, the truth died with Samuel. Following Samuel's death, Eleanor Whitfield's life took on a pattern that would persist for the next 15 years. She continued to live in the family mansion, increasingly isolated from Savannah society. Charles Whitfield managed the estate until his own death in 1851, at which point control passed to Thomas's younger brother Edward. Eleanor, though technically entitled to resume control of her inheritance as a widow, made no effort to do so. According to tax records and business ledgers, the Whitfield plantation continued to prosper throughout the 1840s and early 1850s, though Eleanor appeared to take no interest in its operations. Visitors to the estate during this period described her as ghost-like, pale and silent, drifting through the rooms of the great house as if searching for something lost. She rarely left the property and received few visitors. One of the few people who maintained regular contact with Eleanor during these years was her former attorney, Martin Hayes. Though he had been dismissed from her formal employment following the court's injunction, Hayes continued to visit the Whitfield estate approximately once every 3 months, ostensibly to deliver books and periodicals from his frequent trips to the north. These visits drew suspicion from Edward Whitfield, who in 1854 filed a complaint with the Chatham County Sheriff, suggesting that Hayes might be using his access to the Whitfield property to conduct activities contrary to the public good, a thinly veiled accusation of abolitionist organizing. The sheriff investigated but found no evidence to support Edward's claims, and Hayes's visits were allowed to continue. What is certain is that during these years, Eleanor maintained a detailed private journal, recording her thoughts and memories. This journal, if it still exists, has never been found. However, Hayes made reference to it in a letter to a colleague in Boston, dated March 1856. Mrs. W. continues her solitary documentation of the tragic events that have shaped her existence. She has confided that these writings are intended not for her contemporaries, who would not believe or understand her account, but for posterity. There will come a time, she told me, when the truth can be spoken without fear, and on that day I wish my voice to be heard. If Eleanor intended her journal to reveal the full truth about her relationship with Samuel, Thomas's death, and the subsequent events, her hopes were to be disappointed. On the night of November 12, 1858, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Whitfield mansion, where Eleanor's private quarters were located. By the time the plantation's enslaved workers could organize a response, the flames had spread to much of the main house. Eleanor Whitfield's body was recovered from her bedroom. The coroner's report indicated that she had died of smoke inhalation, apparently in her sleep. She was 51 years old. Also lost in the fire were most of her personal belongings, presumably including her private journals and any other documentation that might have shed light on the events of 1843. The timing of the fire raised questions that were never officially addressed. Just 2 weeks earlier, Edward Whitfield had died unexpectedly of what was described as bilious fever. Control of the estate had passed to his son, Thomas Whitfield II, who had recently returned from college in Virginia with new ideas about modernizing the plantation's operations. According to plantation records, Thomas II had visited his Aunt Eleanor for the first time in several years on the afternoon before the fire, though the content of their conversation was not recorded. In the absence of Eleanor's own testimony, the true nature of her relationship with Samuel, the circumstances of Thomas Whitfield's death, and the reality of Samuel's fate remain shrouded in uncertainty. The official history, as recorded in Chatham County records and family histories, makes little mention of these events. The Whitfield family continued to be prominent in Georgia society until the Civil War diminished their fortunes, as it did for many southern plantation owners. The Whitfield plantation was sold in 1872 to northern investors who converted it to timber production. The mansion, partially rebuilt after the 1858 fire, was maintained as a residence for company managers until 1957, when another fire, this one attributed to faulty electrical wiring, destroyed what remained of the original structure. Today, the site is part of a private timber operation, inaccessible to the public and marked only by the remnants of the original foundation stones, barely visible among the pines and undergrowth. Yet the story of Eleanor Whitfield, Thomas, and Samuel refuses to fade entirely from memory. In 1964, a graduate student at Emory University named Elizabeth Montgomery undertook research for a thesis on women's legal status in antebellum Georgia. During her investigations, she encountered references to the Whitfield case in the newly discovered court documents. Intrigued, she began to piece together the narrative, tracking down surviving correspondence, legal records, and even attempting to locate descendants of people connected to the case who might have preserved family stories or documents. Montgomery's research brought her to Savannah in June 1968, where she arranged to examine the original court documents that had recently been discovered during the courthouse renovations. According to the university records, she spent 3 days working in the Chatham County archives before checking out of her hotel with plans to visit the former Whitfield plantation site. She never arrived for her appointment with the timber company manager who had agreed to escort her to the property. Her rental car was found abandoned on a service road approximately 1 mile from the former plantation entrance. Despite an extensive search by local authorities, no trace of Montgomery herself was ever found. The official explanation was that Montgomery had become disoriented in the densely wooded area, wandered into the swampland that still borders the property, and was likely the victim of exposure or wildlife. Her disappearance was ruled a tragic accident, and after several weeks, the search was officially discontinued. Montgomery's academic advisor, Dr. Harold Jenkins, traveled to Savannah to collect her research materials and personal belongings. Among her possessions was a tape recorder containing an audio diary she had kept during her research trip. On the final recording, dated the evening before her disappearance, Montgomery's voice can be heard saying, "The more I uncover about this case, the more convinced I am that we're dealing with a deliberate suppression of history. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to ensure this story would never be told. Tomorrow, I'll finally see the place where it all happened. I can't shake the feeling that the land itself might hold answers that the documents don't." Jenkins attempted to follow up on Montgomery's research, requesting access to the same court documents she had been examining. To his surprise, county officials informed him that no such documents existed in their archives. When he insisted that his student had been working with these materials just days earlier, he was told that there must have been some misunderstanding. The renovations had uncovered old building plans and some routine tax records, but nothing relating to the Whitfield case or estate. Whether this discrepancy represents a bureaucratic error, deliberate obfuscation, or something more sinister remains unclear. What is certain is that following Montgomery's disappearance, academic interest in the Whitfield case diminished considerably. The few scholars who have attempted to investigate since then have found most official channels surprisingly unhelpful, with many relevant records listed as misplaced or destroyed due to water damage. Today, more than 180 years after the events described, the full truth about Eleanor Whitfield and her husband's slave may never be known. What remains are fragments, court records, personal correspondence, journal entries that allow us to glimpse the outlines of a story that challenges our understanding of relationships in the antebellum South. A story of boundaries crossed, conventions defied, and the terrible price paid by those who dared to claim humanity in a system designed to deny it. Local legend holds that on certain nights, particularly in the humid Georgia summer, when the air hangs heavy and still, the sound of footsteps can be heard on the overgrown path that once led from the main house to the carriage house where Samuel lived. Some say it's Eleanor, eternally searching for the companion she lost. Others claim it's Samuel himself, forever trying to escape the fate that befell him in those dark swamps. And a few suggest it might be the sound of the truth itself, restlessly pacing, waiting for the day when it can finally be heard. In 1967, a construction worker clearing land for a new development approximately 1 mile from the former Whitfield property uncovered human remains beneath a fallen cypress tree. The bones were determined to be well over 100 years old, belonging to an adult male. A length of weathered rope was found with the remains. After a cursory examination, the county medical examiner concluded that the bones likely belonged to a Negro male, identity unknown, and ordered them reinterred in a public cemetery. No connection to the Whitfield case was ever officially established. As for Eleanor's journals, if they survived the fire of 1858, their whereabouts remain unknown. Martin Hayes, in his final letter mentioning Eleanor, before his return to Boston in 1857, wrote, "Mrs. You has entrusted certain documents to my care, with instructions that they remain sealed until 50 years after her death. She believes that by then the world may be ready to receive her testimony with the gravity and compassion it deserves." Hayes died in 1861 during a yellow fever outbreak in Boston. No such documents were listed among his effects, nor have they ever surfaced in any known archive or collection. Perhaps somewhere, in a forgotten trunk in an attic, or in a sealed box in some overlooked corner of a university archive, Eleanor Whitfield's own words wait to be discovered, the final piece in a puzzle that has remained incomplete for nearly 2 centuries. Until that day, her story remains what it has always been, a whispered legend, a shadow of truth glimpsed through the fragments of history, and a reminder of the countless human dramas that played out within the brutal confines of American slavery, leaving traces too faint for history to fully capture, but too significant to entirely disappear. For those who know where to look, the echoes of Eleanor Whitfield's forbidden legacy can still be felt in Savannah, in the moss-draped oaks that line the streets where she once walked, in the weathered stones of Bonaventure Cemetery where Thomas lies, and in the soft rippling of the swamp waters that may have witnessed Samuel's final moments. It is a legacy written not in monuments or official histories, but in absence, in the silence where their voices should be, in the empty space where their truth should stand. And perhaps that absence itself is the most fitting memorial to a love that existed in defiance of its time, invisible to most, denied by many, yet as real and enduring as the land itself. For while buildings may burn and bodies may vanish, the human heart's capacity for connection across every barrier remains, challenging us to see beyond the limitations of our own time and imagine a world where Eleanor and Samuel might have lived their truth in the light of day, rather than in shadows and whispers and the terrible silence of history. In the spring of 1969, nearly a year after Elizabeth Montgomery's disappearance, a package arrived at the office of Dr. Harold Jenkins at Emory University. It contained no return address, only a postmark from Savannah. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and its binding cracked. A brief note accompanied it. "Found among my grandfather's effects. He was a groundskeeper at the old timber company. Said a young lady gave it to him for safekeeping the day before she vanished. Thought you should have it." The book proved to be a diary dating from 1856 to 1858, written in a delicate feminine hand identified by handwriting experts as consistent with samples of Eleanor Whitfield's correspondence preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives. The diary had evidently been kept hidden at the plantation and then removed shortly before the fire that claimed Eleanor's life. Its contents provide the most direct insight into Eleanor's thoughts during the final years of her life, and by extension, cast new light on the events of 1843. The entries begin sparsely, with brief notations about weather and household matters, but gradually become more revealing as Eleanor apparently grew more confident in the diary's security. An entry from December 12th, 1856 reads, "15 years since I lost them both. Thomas, despite everything, was my husband, but S was my heart's true companion. Neither death was what the world believes. Both haunt me equally." This enigmatic reference is clarified somewhat by an entry from February 3rd, 1857. "Had the dream again last night. Tea at dinner, face growing red, reaching for his throat as the poison took effect. My hand not on the decanter as memory serves, but on his shoulder, steadying him as though in concern. Whose hand then? I know, but cannot bear to write it even here." The implication that Thomas Whitfield was indeed murdered by poison rather than dying of apoplexy, as officially recorded, is startling enough. But more shocking is Eleanor's suggestion that while she was present at the time of his death, she was not the one who administered the poison. If her dream memory is to be believed, someone else in the household had poisoned Thomas's drink, raising the disturbing possibility that she had been made an unwitting accomplice to her husband's murder. A later entry, dated March 28, 1857, seems to confirm this suspicion. M.H., presumably Martin Hayes, brought news today that has reopened all old wounds. Edward found the letters. When S. learned that T. planned to sell him to separate us, he wrote to a man in Boston, an abolitionist with whom he had somehow established correspondence. This man agreed to help S. escape north. The plan was in motion when T. died so unexpectedly. Edward believes I knew of these letters, that I conspired with S. to eliminate T. and free himself. He is wrong. I knew nothing of S.'s plans until after T. was gone. If Eleanor's private writings are to be believed, she was not involved in any plot against her husband's life. The diary suggests instead that Samuel had independently sought a route to freedom, possibly motivated by Thomas's threats to sell him. If Samuel did indeed poison Thomas Whitfield, he may have done so not only to avoid being sold away from Eleanor, but to create an opportunity for escape that was ultimately never realized. The diary contains another revelation, perhaps the most significant of all, in an entry dated June 17, 1857. I dream sometimes of the child that never was. What would he have become, this impossible son of two worlds? He would be 14 now, had he lived. Would he have his father's keen mind, his quiet dignity? Would he have my eyes, my restlessness? Some nights I imagine a different life entirely. The three of us fled north to Canada or Europe, living openly as a family. A fantasy so forbidden, I dare not whisper it even to these pages. This passage confirms the romantic nature of Eleanor and Samuel's relationship and explicitly references the pregnancy that ended in miscarriage. The entry suggests that Eleanor had imagined a future with Samuel and their child, a vision impossible to realize in 19th century Georgia. The final pages of the diary take on an increasingly urgent tone. An entry from October 3rd, 1858, just over a month before the fire, reads, "Edward grows suspicious of what I know. Yesterday he questioned me about T's final dinner, details I have not thought of in years. Does he suspect the truth after all this time? He watches me constantly. I fear what he might do if he confirms his suspicions. I have given my most important papers to M.H. for safekeeping, but this diary I keep close. It alone contains the full truth." The very last entry, dated November 10th, 1858, just 2 days before the fire that claimed Eleanor's life, is perhaps the most chilling. Thomas II visited today. So like his father in appearance, yet there is something cold in his eyes that reminds me of Charles. He asked pointed questions about the old days, about S in particular. How much has Edward told him? He examined the East Wing with unusual interest, particularly my bedchamber. I told Mary, presumably a house servant, to sleep in my dressing room tonight. I do not trust the look I saw in young Thomas's eyes. The diary ends there. 2 nights later, the fire that started in the East Wing would claim Eleanor's life. The timing, combined with her expressed concerns about Thomas Whitfield II's interest in her bedchamber, raises the disturbing possibility that her death was not accidental, but the final act in a decades-long effort to conceal the truth about the events of 1843. What becomes clear from Eleanor's diary is that the narrative of the widow Whitfield and her husband's slave was far more complex than even the fragmented historical record suggested. It was not simply a case of a white woman defying convention to secure the freedom of an enslaved man with whom she had formed an attachment. It was a tragedy of multiple dimensions. A murder, possibly committed by Samuel to prevent being sold away from Eleanor. A pregnancy that, had it come to term, would have produced a child whose very existence challenged the social order. And finally, a decades-long conspiracy by the Whitfield family to conceal these truths. culminating potentially in Eleanor's own murder. The discovery of Eleanor's diary might have been expected to cause a sensation in academic circles, finally bringing to light the full story of this antebellum drama. Yet strangely, Dr. Jenkins never published his findings. According to university records, he took an unexpected sabbatical shortly after receiving the diary and then retired early the following year, moving to a small town in northern Minnesota, where he lived in relative seclusion until his death in 1986. The diary itself disappeared from public record. Inquiries to Jenkins's estate following his death revealed no trace of it among his personal effects or papers donated to the university. His former colleagues recalled that he had become increasingly paranoid during his final months at Emory, claiming that he was being followed and that his office had been searched. Most attributed these concerns to the stress of Montgomery's disappearance and his approaching retirement. In 1992, Jenkins's daughter, Margaret Jenkins Cooper, gave an interview to a graduate student researching academic freedom in the 1960s. In it, she mentioned that her father had indeed possessed a small, very old diary that he kept locked in his desk drawer. He would sometimes sit up late at night reading it, making notes, she recalled. Once I asked him what it was, and he told me it contained a story that was still too dangerous to tell. I thought he was being dramatic, but looking back, I wonder. After his retirement, he buried something in the backyard of our family cabin. He never told me what it was, but he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I should dig it up and take it to a historian he trusted, a woman at Columbia University. Nothing ever did happen to him, though. He died peacefully in his sleep. I never did dig up whatever it was. Cooper's testimony suggests that Jenkins may have hidden Eleanor's diary rather than risk its destruction or suppression. If so, it may still exist, buried in the grounds of a cabin in rural Minnesota. Yet another layer of concealment in a story characterized by secrets and silence. The property where the Whitfield plantation once stood has changed hands multiple times since the 1950s. Today, it is part of a private nature preserve, closed to the public and carefully guarded against trespassers. Satellite imagery shows that the land has largely returned to forest, with little visible evidence of its plantation past. The foundation stones of the mansion, which were still visible in the 1960s, have apparently been removed or have sunk beneath the soil and undergrowth. Local residents report that the current owners, a conservation trust with ties to several prominent Georgia families, have shown unusual interest in preventing archaeological research on the property. Applications for survey permits have been consistently denied, citing concerns about disrupting the natural habitat. Historians seeking access to study the site have been turned away by security personnel who patrol the property boundaries. This continued resistance to investigation, more than 180 years after the events in question, suggests that even now, the full story of Eleanor Whitfield, Thomas, and Samuel remains threatening to someone. Perhaps it is simply the general discomfort that many feel when confronted with the complex, often contradictory realities of the antebellum South, a society founded on strict racial hierarchies, yet riddled with relationships that crossed those very boundaries. Or perhaps there is something more specific at stake: family reputations, inheritance claims, or legal liabilities that might still be affected by revelations about events long past. The Whitfield name remains respected in certain circles of Georgia society, with descendants serving in state government, heading corporations, and sitting on the boards of influential cultural institutions. A definitive exposure of the family's historical secrets might still have repercussions today. What is certain is that the story of Eleanor Whitfield and Samuel represents a counter-narrative to the simplified version of history often presented in textbooks and monuments. Their relationship, whatever its exact nature, challenges the notion that the lines between enslaved and enslaver, black and white, were always clearly drawn and never crossed. It reminds us that human connections form even in the most hostile environments, and that the heart often refuses to recognize the boundaries society creates. In the summer of 2007, a group of Emory University students undertaking an independent study project on historical research methods decided to visit the former Whitfield plantation site. Unable to gain official permission, they accessed the property under cover of darkness, hoping to document any remaining physical evidence of the plantation's existence. According to an anonymous blog post that appeared briefly online before being removed, the students found more than they expected. Deep in the property, well away from the road and accessible only by a nearly invisible footpath, they discovered what appeared to be the remains of a small structure, a cabin or outbuilding that had been deliberately concealed by vegetation. Near this structure, partially buried, was a stone marker with the initial S crudely carved into it. The students speculated that this might have been a memorial to Samuel, placed there secretly by Eleanor or someone else who knew the truth of his fate. Before they could document their find more thoroughly or conduct any excavation, they were discovered by security personnel and escorted from the property. No charges were filed, but university officials reportedly received a strongly worded letter from the property owner's legal representatives warning against any future trespassing. The students' discovery, if accurate, suggests that someone, perhaps Eleanor herself, wanted to ensure that Samuel would not be entirely forgotten, that some marker of his existence would remain on the land where he had lived and died. It is a poignant reminder that behind the dry legal documents and official histories lie real human lives and emotions, love, loss, hope and despair that no court record or newspaper account can fully capture. Today, the story of Eleanor Whitfield and Samuel exists in a liminal space between documented history and legend. The official records tell one story. A wealthy plantation owner died of natural causes. His young widow behaved erratically following his death. A valuable slave attempted escape and died in the process. The widow lived out her days in seclusion until dying in a house fire. But the fragments that have emerged over the years, Turner's journal, Eleanor's diary, the hidden grave marker, hint at a different narrative altogether, one of forbidden love, murder, conspiracy, and a truth so dangerous it has been actively suppressed for nearly 2 centuries. Perhaps someday, Eleanor's complete diary will be found, or archaeological investigation of the plantation site will be permitted, or some descendant of the Whitfield family will come forward with documents preserved through generations of silence. Until then, the full truth remains elusive, hidden beneath layers of time, prejudice, and deliberate obscuration. Yet the story persists, whispered among historians, debated in academic journals, and now shared here. It persists because it speaks to something fundamental about human experience, the tension between social constraints and personal desires, between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. Eleanor and Samuel, whatever the exact nature of their relationship, existed at the painful intersection of these tensions. Their story, with all its ambiguities and unanswered questions, offers no easy moral lessons or comfortable conclusions. Instead, it reminds us of the complex, contradictory reality of the past and the countless human stories that history has yet to fully tell. Some locals say that on summer nights, when the moon is high and the Spanish moss sways in the humid Georgia breeze, 2 figures can sometimes be glimpsed walking together on the old plantation grounds, a woman in 19th century dress and a tall man by her side. They appear briefly among the trees, observers claim, before vanishing into the shadows. Scientists and skeptics dismiss such sightings as the product of imagination and folklore, but those who have seen the figures insist there is something more at work. as if the land itself remembers what happened there, as if some echo of Eleanor and Samuel remains, still seeking the justice and recognition denied to them in life. Whether one believes in such supernatural possibilities or not, there is something compelling about the idea that their story refuses to be entirely forgotten, that it continues to emerge despite all efforts to suppress it. Perhaps that persistence itself is a kind of justice, the acknowledgement that their lives mattered, that what happened to them matters still, that the truth, however fragmented and incomplete, deserves to be known. In the words Eleanor reportedly spoke to Martin Hayes before entrusting him with her documents, "There will come a time when the truth can be spoken without fear." More than 180 years later, we may still be waiting for that time to fully arrive. But in sharing what we know of their story, in piecing together the fragments that have survived years of intentional obscurity, we move one step closer to the reckoning with history that Eleanor envisioned. A reckoning not just with the specific events of her life, but with the larger truths about humanity that her story reveals. The cemetery where Thomas Whitfield was laid to rest still exists, his family mausoleum still standing, though weathered by time and neglect. Eleanor, according to property records, was buried in the family plot as well, though her grave is unmarked. Of Samuel's final resting place, nothing certain is known beyond the students' contested discovery of a stone marker deep in the woods. 3 lives, connected by circumstance, choice, and perhaps love, now separated even in death. Thomas, immortalized in stone, Eleanor, present but unnamed, Samuel, absent entirely from official memory. Yet in another sense, they remain forever linked by the events of 1843, by the secrets they shared and the truths they concealed, and by the enduring power of their story to fascinate, disturb, and challenge us nearly 2 centuries later. In that persistence, in our continued desire to understand what happened at the Whitfield plantation, Eleanor, Thomas, and Samuel achieve a kind of immortality, not the comfortable remembrance of conventional history, but the more complicated, more human legacy of a story that refuses to fit neatly into the categories we create. The final word on the matter, perhaps, belongs to Eleanor herself, in what may be the most revealing passage from her recovered diary, dated January 1st, 1857. "They will never understand what existed between S and myself. How could they? They see only categories, master and slave, white and black, proper and forbidden. They cannot imagine that 2 souls might recognize each other across such divides, that one might find in the most unlikely place the person who sees them truly. For 15 years, I have carried the weight of this truth alone. I have paid for it with my freedom, my reputation, my child, and the life of the man I loved. Yet even knowing the cost, I would change nothing. To have known even briefly what it means to be fully seen and fully loved, this is worth any price. In the world determined to keep us separate, we found each other. That is our victory, however short-lived, however tragic its end."